The gilded doors of Buckingham Palace have witnessed centuries of power, secrets, and carefully staged spectacle. But nothing in living memory prepared the royal household or the watching world for the moment Queen Camilla rose from her seat, turned her back on the assembled senior royals, and walked out. It happened inside the historic Belgian suite, the very rooms once occupied by visiting monarchs and now the quiet nerve center of a new reign. The air was thick with the scent of polished wood, fresh flowers, and unspoken tension. King Charles sat at the head of the long table. Princess Anne's expression was carved from stone. Prince William's jaw was tight. And then the Lord Chamberlain cleared his throat and began to read the memorandum that would change everything. The palace had just confirmed it. In black ink on heavy cream paper, the words landed like a physical blow. The line of succession was being formally adjusted in a way no one outside a tiny circle of advisors had anticipated. The changes were not cosmetic. They were structural. They touched the future of the crown itself. Camilla did not raise her voice. She did not slam a fist on the table. She simply stood, gathered the silk of her dress with one elegant motion, and walked toward the double doors. The room froze. Footmen stiffened. A junior private secretary nearly dropped his notes. For several stunned seconds no one moved. Then the doors closed behind her with a soft, final click that somehow sounded louder than any argument. What followed was chaos wrapped in protocol. Within the hour, encrypted phones lit up across London. By evening, the first carefully leaked phrases were already circulating among trusted correspondents. Unprecedented, constitutional implications, the Queen Consort position, and the one that made every headline writer sit up straighter, walking out. This is a story of how a single, wordless departure became the most explosive royal moment of the decade. And it begins long before that closed-door meeting. For years, the public had been fed a carefully managed narrative. Camilla, once the most controversial woman in Britain, had transformed into the steady partner at Charles's side. The long campaign of rehabilitation had worked. Approval ratings rose. The wicked stepmother image softened into something closer to reluctant respect. She performed her duties with dry humor and visible loyalty. She stood beside the king through illness, through the slow recovery of public affection, through the endless cycle of engagements that keep the monarchy breathing. But inside the palace the temperature was different. Sources close to the household describe a growing undercurrent of friction that had nothing to do with the old scandals and everything to do with the future. The king's health, the Prince of Wales's expanding role, the delicate balance between tradition and the demands of a modern public, all of it was being recalibrated in private. And at the center of the recalibration sat a quiet but fierce question. What exactly would the next chapter of the monarchy look like, and who would hold real influence within it? The memorandum presented that afternoon answered the question in a way Camilla found intolerable. According to multiple accounts pieced together from those present and those briefed immediately afterward, the document outlined a series of formal adjustments to the practical working of the succession and the supporting architecture around it. While the fundamental order of succession itself, William, then George, Charlotte, Louis, remained untouched by statute, the accompanying changes to titles, residences, financial arrangements, and the composition of the king's closest advisory circle were described as shocking by those who saw the papers. One senior figure later called them a quiet rewriting of the rules of the game. Camilla's reaction was not, sources insist, about personal vanity. It was about principle, about the understanding she believed she had entered into when she accepted the role of Queen Consort, and about the legacy she intended to protect. In the days leading up to the meeting, she had argued her case in private. She had sought assurances. She had been given them, until the formal confirmation arrived and those assurances evaporated. When the Lord Chamberlain finished reading, the silence that followed was absolute. Charles looked toward his wife. She met his eyes for a long moment. Then she stood. The walk to the doors took fewer than 10 seconds. In royal terms, it was an eternity. No one followed her. Protocol demanded that the king remain seated. The others waited for a cue that never came. Only when the doors had closed did Princess Anne lean forward and speak the first words anyone remembers. Well, that settles that. Outside the room, Camilla did not retreat to her private apartments in tears. She walked the length of the corridor with the same measured pace she uses on official engagements, acknowledging staff with a brief nod, and continued until she reached the smaller drawing room where she remained for nearly 40 minutes. When she emerged, her expression was composed. She cancelled the remainder of her scheduled internal meetings for the day and left the palace by a side entrance. The official diary simply recorded that Her Majesty the Queen had withdrawn from the afternoon's discussions for personal reasons. The personal reasons, of course, were anything but private for long. By nightfall, the first anonymous briefings had reached select journalists. The language was careful, the details sparse, but the central image was impossible to suppress. The Queen Consort had walked out of a formal palace meeting after the confirmation of major changes to the royal line supporting structure. Within 24 hours, the story had leapt from whispered corridors to the front pages of every major newspaper and the top of every news bulletin. The palace's initial response was classic, a brief statement confirming that productive discussions regarding the future working of the monarchy had taken place and that all senior members of the royal family remained fully committed to the service of the nation. It did not mention Camilla's departure. It did not need to. The vacuum of official silence only accelerated the speculation. What exactly were the changes that proved so unacceptable? Insiders describe a package that touched three sensitive areas. First, the formal elevation of certain supporting roles around the Prince of Wales, effectively accelerating the transition of day-to-day authority in ways that reduced the consort's traditional soft power. Second, adjustments to the occupancy and funding of key royal residences that altered long-standing assumptions about Camilla's future arrangements. Third, and most contentious, a redefinition of the advisory mechanisms closest to the sovereign that appeared to sideline voices Camilla had come to rely upon. None of these alterations required an act of parliament. They were matters of royal prerogative and internal household management. That fact made them both easier to implement and harder to challenge publicly. Camilla's walkout was, in effect, the only form of protest available to her inside the system. Those who know her well say the decision was not impulsive. She had spent weeks weighing the consequences. Walking out carried risks. It could be portrayed as disloyalty, as instability, as confirmation of every old critic's darkest predictions. Remaining silent carried another kind of cost. The quiet acceptance of the diminished role at the very moment the monarchy was being reshaped for the next generation. She chose the visible protest. In the days that followed, the royal household entered a period of carefully managed crisis. Charles and Camilla were seen together at a subsequent public engagement, both smiling, both performing the choreography of unity. The images were studied frame by frame. Commentators noted the distance between them, the absence of the small gestures of affection that had become familiar. Behind the scenes, intermediaries worked overtime. Messages were exchanged. Assurances were sought and, according to some reports, partially given. Yet the fundamental issue remained unresolved. The memorandum had been confirmed. The changes were in motion. And the image of the Queen Consort turning her back on the table and walking away had already entered the permanent visual archive of the reign. What no one could yet answer was a larger question the walkout forced into the open, in a monarchy defined by continuity and restraint. What happens when the person closest to the sovereign decides that silence is no longer sustainable? The story did not end with the closing of those double doors. It had only begun. The coming weeks would reveal whether Camilla's dramatic departure was a momentary flash of frustration or the opening move in a deeper realignment of power inside the House of Windsor. The palace had confirmed the changes. The Queen had answered in the only language left to her. And the world was watching. The fallout arrived in waves. First came the official silence, polished and impenetrable. Then the carefully calibrated counter-briefings. Within 48 hours, senior aides were emphasizing that the Queen Consort remained fully engaged in the life of the monarchy and that any suggestion of a rift was wildly overstated. Yet the photographs told a different story. At a subsequent engagement at Westminster Abbey, Camilla stood a precise half-step farther from the king than usual. Her smile was professional. Her eyes did not seek his. Observers who had watched the couple for decades noted the absence of the small, almost unconscious gestures that had once signaled private solidarity in public. Behind the palace walls, the temperature continued to rise. According to multiple sources familiar with the internal discussions, Camilla's walkout had forced an emergency recalibration of the very changes that provoked it. The original memorandum had been drawn up with the expectation of quiet acceptance. Her departure turned a bureaucratic adjustment into a public relations emergency. Overnight, language that had been firm became provisional. Timelines that had been fixed became under review. One senior courtier later admitted, off the record, that the Queen Consort silent protest had achieved in 10 seconds what months of private argument had failed to accomplish. It made the consequences of marginalizing her impossible to ignore. Yet the underlying pressure did not disappear. The driving force behind the changes remained the same, the steady transfer of operational authority toward the Prince of Wales and his household. William's team had grown in confidence and competence. The king's health, while carefully managed, had made the need for clearer lines of succession planning undeniable. In that context, Camilla's traditional soft power, her ability to shape the social and ceremonial atmosphere around the sovereign, was increasingly viewed by some as an obstacle rather than an asset. The walkout did not erase that calculation. It merely forced the architects of the new order to proceed with greater caution and more elaborate assurances. Public reaction split along predictable but revealing lines. Traditionalists praised Camilla for defending the dignity of her office and the understanding under which she had accepted the role of Queen Consort. Younger commentators and reform-minded voices saw her protest as evidence that the monarchy still struggled with transparency and modern accountability. Social media filled with competing narratives. Camilla the steadfast partner betrayed by palace machinery. Camilla the last remnant of an older, less democratic style of royal influence. Both interpretations contained fragments of truth. Neither captured the full complexity of a woman who had spent decades mastering the art of survival inside the most scrutinized family on earth. Inside the household, the human cost was quieter and more personal. Staff who had served Camilla for years described a period of intense private reflection. She continued her public duties with characteristic discipline, visiting hospitals, attending memorials, hosting receptions, but those closest to her noted a new steel in her manner. The warmth that had gradually won over much of the public remained, yet it was now edged with something sharper. One long-time had observed that the Queen Consort had stopped pretending the system would protect her interests automatically. From that moment forward, every conversation, every seating plan, every allocation of resources was examined through a colder lens. Charles found himself in an impossible position. The king who had waited a lifetime for the crown now faced the prospect of his closest companion becoming a source of visible tension at the precise moment he needed institutional calm. Those who saw the couple in private reported difficult conversations conducted with a mutual respect of long partnership and the mutual exhaustion of people who have already endured decades of public judgment. There was no shouting. There was something more corrosive, the slow recognition that their interests, once aligned by shared adversity, were beginning to diverge under weight of institutional necessity. The changes themselves continued, albeit in modified form. Certain residences were reallocated with greater sensitivity to Camilla's preferences. Advisory structures were adjusted to retain a formal channel for her input. The most aggressive elements of the original memorandum were softened, yet the direction of travel remained clear. Power was moving toward the next generation. The consort's role was being redefined as supportive rather than co-shaping. For a woman who had fought her way from social exile to the highest ranks of the monarchy, the distinction was not trivial. Weeks after the walkout, a second, quieter meeting took place. This time there were no formal papers, no Lord Chamberlain reading from a prepared text. Just the king, the queen, and a handful of the most senior advisors. The discussion was frank. Assurances were exchanged. A working compromise was reached, one that preserved the substance of the succession-related reforms while restoring a measure of the dignity Camilla believed had been threatened. When she left that meeting, she did not walk out. She stayed until the end. The difference was noted by everyone present. Yet the original image lingered. In an age of relentless visual media, the sight of a queen consort rising from the table and turning her back on the machinery of the monarchy had become indelible. It joined the gallery of defining royal moments. Diana's interview, the Queen's silent car journey after the death of her daughter-in-law, Charles's succession speech, moments when the carefully maintained surface cracked just enough to reveal the human stakes beneath. Historians of the monarchy will debate the long-term significance of that afternoon in the Belgian suite. Some will argue it was a temporary flare-up, quickly contained by the institution's famous talent for absorption and reinvention. Others will see it as an early symptom of deeper structural tension, the difficulty of reconciling a modern expectation of partnership with an ancient system built on hierarchy and primogeniture. Both views may prove partially correct. What cannot be disputed is the immediate effect. Camilla's walkout forced the palace to confront the cost of treating the Queen Consort as a secondary consideration in the redesign of the royal future. In the months that followed, the public saw a carefully restored picture unity. Joint appearances resumed their familiar rhythm. The language of official statements returned to its usual bland reassurance. Yet those who watched closely noticed subtle shifts. Camilla's diary filled with independent engagements that showcase her own priorities and relationships. Her public remarks, always measured, carried occasional notes of unmistakable firmness when speaking about loyalty, service, and the importance of mutual respect within institutions. She had learned the lesson of the closed doors. Silence can be interpreted as consent, and consent, once given, is difficult to retract. The royal line continued its slow, inevitable advance toward the next generation. William and Catherine prepared for the responsibilities that would one day be theirs. The children of the Waleses grew under the intensified scrutiny that accompanies proximity to the throne. And Camilla, once the most polarizing figure in British public life, occupied a new and complex position, no longer merely the survivor of old scandals, but the woman who had, for a brief and unforgettable moment, refused to remain seated while the future was decided without her. The palace confirmed the changes. The Queen walked out, and in doing so she reminded an ancient institution of a simple modern truth. Even inside the most hierarchical of systems, power is never entirely one-directional. Sometimes the most eloquent statement requires no words at all, only the decision to stand, turn, and leave the room. The story of that afternoon continues to unfold in ways both visible and hidden. The monarchy endures, as it always has, by adapting. But adaptation, as Camilla demonstrated, is not always quiet. Sometimes it begins with the sound of a door closing, and the knowledge that the person who walked through it will not easily be forgotten.